Welcome to Season 2 of the Color Success Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. I'm so excited to have a special guest on today, a true dream guest. Andrew Phung is known for his role as the hilarious, likable, and loyal Kimchee on the show Kim's Convenience. We bond over wrestling and food. We explore the therapeutic value of improv, which led him to the Loose Moose Theater Company to share his stories and voice, ultimately leading to a change in his career path from law to acting. Andrew emphasizes boundaries, positivity, family, and storytelling through self-expression as keys to mental health. We end with a game of word association with him answering as Andrew and then as Kimchee. I guess kind of jumping right in, how did you pursue the arts or decide to go in that direction?
Well, I think my parents are Vietnamese Chinese parents. I think with all Asian parents, they want the best for their kids. And they wanted me to be like an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer. Lawyer was a big one because of my cousin's son is a lawyer out in Houston. And I remember in high school, I took drama class because I enjoy like dramatic arts. And as we had mentioned earlier, we both like professional wrestling.
Yes.
Wrestling is just drama, you know?
It really is a soap opera. Like there's so much
really
that goes into it.
Yeah, there's storytelling and characters. And so I took drama because it was an interest. And my drama teacher brought in an improv like instructor for the week. And I remember like he blew my mind because schools are all about rules and they're about like what you can and cannot do. Whereas improv was like, well, you should just say yes and it's like encouraging you to be open to suggestions and offers. And so then my teacher encouraged all of us to go down to this theater in Calgary called the Loose Moose Theater Company. And she said, they'll train you for free. And I often look back at that and I think it's the single reason why I'm in the arts. And not just me, because out of the group of us, one works in like marketing for TV and film. One is a stand-up comedian. One is a producer for corporate videos. One was an actor, but now he owns a speech school for students.
Oh, wow.
And then there's me who went to the arts fully. So it's like, though not all of us are actors and improvisers, all five of us are in the creative industry in some way, shape, or form. But it's because that theater didn't charge us. The exchange was, hey, you volunteer, you get to take classes for free. So it was like my safe space. I got to do improv and I did it and it became part of my DNA. And even going through university, even getting a degree in economics and business, having a 9-to-5 job, improv was like my side hustle. And then there was a day where I'm like, yo, I could make a living doing this, specifically with the corporate MCing. And that's from my business degree. I was like, oh, I could MC events. I would be at events and conferences and I'm like, yo, these hosts suck. I can do a better job. And so I went after that market and that was like my big thing, corporate MCing. And then improv and like developing improv shows. And then I started creating my own improv shows and I would make that money. So I remember like, if you break down the economics of it, I remember I could put up a 2-day run of improv shows at my theater and charge $25 to $30 a ticket. And myself and my improv partner could walk away with $3,000 each. Plus we paid our tech, the theater, and the volunteers. And I always thought that I'm like, that's incredible for an improv show.
Yeah.
So we would just do that. Like every couple months we put on a big show. And that was kind of like my career before, Kim's Convenience. But that was it. That's how I got into the arts. I just like started liking doing improv and they let me do it for free.
And I mean, that's so important too, because it increases access to the arts. And I think that's one of the biggest things, right? Is like, we can't all afford to buy a violin. I mean, over here in the Bay Area, it's like all the Asian parents want you to play piano. And I take Korean because here's my thing. I love Korean dramas. And that's how Kim's Convenience kind of popped up after one of my dramas, funny enough. And so I take Korean classes. I'm Chinese, but I take them. And I heard in the background, one of the teachers, like they were either listening to piano music or their kid was playing piano. So like, that's the thing here. And it's just so cool that you were able to get into improv.
Well, like I think it's funny because like Asian parents are more willing to buy you a grand piano than they are to pay like the $50 for an improv class. But that's really
Right.
what it is. It's access. And I always say like we talk about, oh, why aren't there more people of color in these creative areas? And I'm always like, it's just like the upbringing, right? And so I'm an advocate for theater companies and production groups to create like streams where underrepresented voices can get in and just take classes and access. But the biggest thing for me was I wasn't in like a Asian colored only stream.
Right.
It was you're in it together, right? And so I just played with the main company so quickly. And I think that was so helpful to my growth. And I had a friend a few years ago was like casting for like a theater group, and I was like, yo dude, where's all your colored people, man? And he's like, oh, he's like, they sucked. And I was like, yeah, but you know why they sucked? Because they didn't have voice lessons when they were kids. They didn't do theater camp, right?
Right.
But they showed up, and rather than turning them away, you should say, hey, you know what, you're not quite ready yet, but do you want to come like join, you want to workshop
Learn.
with us?
Mhm.
Yeah, because I'm like, the hardest part is them showing up. And once you turn them away, they'll never come back.
Right. I
And
think it's a
so,
self-confidence thing too, right?
yeah, like if you get turned away, like, you know, like you're just like, maybe it's not for me. And we hear that a lot in these industries. And we hear it's like, oh, it's not for me. So I'm an advocate on like equality in regards to access to programs and stage time. But improv is a really gentle place because stand-up comedy is like a very solo thing from what I've seen and what I've encountered, whereas improv's about group and partners and duos and trios. And so it was such a safe space. And I mean it because like Fridays and Saturdays, I got to be at the Loose Moose doing improv, working show, scooping popcorn, making stupid Star Trek references with my friends, you know, talking about wrestling. Like wrestling was really big at that time still. And it was such a freeing place. And I think it's shaped who I am as a person.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of the mental health aspect, I mean, you're able to express yourself and the team dynamic is really great because you're not isolated. Can we broaden the
Yeah.
perspective of what you can do, not only in the arts, but in general? Because not everyone wants to be a lawyer. And then when they get into maybe corporate law or whatever it is, they're like, what am I doing with my life? And I see so many young kids with quarter life crises.
Oh, well, years ago, I visited my cousin in New York, and the same cousin was living in New York as a lawyer. And I just finished university, and I'm like, oh, son, I think I want to be a lawyer. And he looked at me. He's like, you want to be a lawyer? I'm a lawyer. A monkey can do my job. And he was like, Andrew, keep doing what you're doing as an actor right now. And I was like, oh. And what's really nice, what's really heartwarming is that in the last 5 years, he started doing stand-up.
Wow.
And so he's like a late 40s, early 50s lawyer doing stand-up. And he's like, you know what? I want to live my dream now. And so he was really helpful in encouraging me to go after this side. And you're right about the mental health side. And I know that's going to be part of our discussion, but like I had my own improv show every Friday for like 4 years. And it was just literally me and my improv partner, Renee. And every week we would just take all the stuff from the week and do it on stage. And whether it was like a frustration we had, an incident we had, a concern, a news headline, we would do it. And I remember like Renee backstage one day, she was like, she brought up some drama with a boyfriend. And I was like, cool. As we stepped on the stage, I'm like, yo, Renee, let's do a scene about your boyfriend. She's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, let's do it. There was like such therapeutic moments with improv, and it's the art. It's like, with like, yo, piano might be your thing. Piano's not my thing. I do not have the hand dexterity. Oh, I suck. But if it's your thing and you get your emotions out that way, and I think that improv for so long for me was like my gateway of therapy, of like dealing with stuff on stage. And I think it's really helped. And I think why in pandemic right now, I'm missing improv so much, because it was my freedom, my gateway. And to not have it is difficult, and you have to find new things to do. Yeah.
How do you get into that vulnerable space? Because I mean, Renee is awesome, sounds awesome because she's like,
Yeah.
yeah, let's talk about my boyfriend.
Yeah.
But I mean, how do you put it all out there? Do you have to get mentally prepared, or is it just kind of like impulse? Let's put it out there.
Stephanie, that's fantastic. That's a great point of view because I've taught a lot of improv, and for a lot of people, it's hard to dig deep into their personal life because I think really good improv is based on your reality and your point of view on it.
Sure.
The characters you create. And I think that's hard for some people. And so much of improv class is unleashing that. I think for me, early on, a lot of my best and big characters were like my mom. I played my mom on stage a lot, and it was just so helpful. They'd set up a scene, and be like, Andrew, can you play a mom? And I would be like, yo, can I play Asian mom? Can I play Vietnamese mom? And they'd be like, yeah. And I'm like, okay. And Vietnamese mom always had a different point of view. So the scenes were so fresh, but it was just really nice to share that with the audience. And I think that my Vietnamese mom, when Mai Nguyen connected with the audience, I felt so comfortable sharing more and more. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's transitioned me well into my career now, but so much of my improv was like personal. And one of my first big improv shows was called Northeast the Show. And I grew up in the Northeast of Calgary. And so we would just do scenes about growing up in the Northeast. And someone in our first run of shows said, Andrew, look at your audience. And I looked, and it was the most diverse audience I'd ever seen at an improv show. And it meant that me sharing was drawing in audience members who had never connected to improv in the same way. And so I think it was just an experiment of giving a little bit more to the audience, sharing a character, sharing a point of view, sharing a joke, but then having people react to it. Yeah. And that kind of felt really good. And there was like a little bit, I don't know if you have it in the US, but I'm not sure you do. Do you have McCain's cake? It's like frozen cake.
I haven't heard
of it. You'd have to it comes in a metal tin container and you have to roll up the edge.
It sounds like Stouffer's lasagna.
Oh, kind of, yeah. But I remember doing it and I was breaking the edge and I cut my finger and I licked it and the audience lost it. And I'm like, that's what bonds us. Cause we're at the end of the day, for me, it was like being a kid who came home. My parents were too busy working. So I had to I would go to the fridge and the freezer. There might be some cake. I got to eat it. But it's it's sharing a little bit and connecting. And the more universal, the more relatable we make it, the bigger the audience. And now I'm like an open book on stage. I'll share anything on stage now because it's just become the norm.
And I imagine it helped you embrace your identity because what you're really talking about is you're not embarrassed by any of those things. This is who you are. And I think a lot of Asians, they've talked about growing up in an area where they were the only Asian. And so that really may have led to bullying or isolation or having to have that imposter syndrome of I have to fit in with the boys, So what you're saying is you created this space where you really had that identity aspect, to feel accepted.
Yeah. And, to be fair, I think improv in Calgary was a pretty white dominated space. Improv anywhere is pretty white heavy.
Sure.
But I think at this company in particular, they're really good about encouraging me to utilize my background on stage. And I also think it's the circumstance of growing up in the Northeast of Calgary, because growing up in a very culturally diverse neighborhood, my friends were South Asian, Filipino, Indigenous, Black, Irish, so
melting pot.
Yeah, it was a melting pot. We literally we kind of knew everyone's cultures, and we would kind of make fun of each other a little bit, but not in a negative way. Yeah. We would just be oh, so-and-so's parents are really strict because they're Costa Rican.
That's totally Vic. That's what he does with his coworkers, by the way.
We learned that it wasn't a negative thing. We just that was our guide to the street. But I do feel I grew up with this Asian pride. And you mentioned the Bay Area, because I remember do you remember the song Got Rice?
Yep.
when Got Rice came out, I remember that was like the anthem for Asian kids.
Yeah.
It was like, yeah, Got Rice. Like we were so proud to be
So
Asian.
happy.
I always said that California Asians are like next level Asians. Like y'all got your own thing going on. But when that song came out, I remember just like, yeah, like it was the cusp of like internet age and like downloading. And I feel like as I grew up in my teenage years and my adult years, there was a sense of Asian pride. And then in my 20s, it was more of like a, not Asian pride, but like a, hey, what is my Vietnamese heritage past Canadian Vietnamese Chinese?
Sure.
And so I've been asking more questions about my heritage to my parents and getting some incredibly heart-wrenching stories that I'm always like, oh man, I complain when they don't have something on the menu on Uber Eats. You came to this country with nothing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like I did have a really big sense of pride growing up, which is why when I'm on a show like Kim's Convenience, I love it. And when people stop me, today I went to Costco and people stop me multiple times just to be like, are you that guy on TV? And I'm like, yeah, I am. And they're like, yo, can we get a picture? I'm like, of course you can get a picture, because I think that like, I'm proud of my work. I'm proud of who I am. And so I'm really happy that improv and the theater gave me that sense of to share my pride.
Yeah. And I mean, you're just so down to earth. I mean, I have to say, it's just like, you seem like I'm talking to like an older friend that I went to high school with. Honestly, I mean, you would have fit in great in the Bay Area for sure.
Oh, for real?
Oh no, yeah, you would be next level Asian in the Bay. So, but I'm glad you were in, Canada and did your thing, because we wouldn't see you where you are today likely, because Vic and I, we actually met in high school. So we've been together for 20 years.
Wow.
He was a jock, I was a nerd. There you go. And now we have 2 kids who are Chinese Vietnamese now.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So but our high school is 90% Asian. And everyone was expected to go to college. Like, it was never a discussion that you weren't going to go.
Hey, who's the most, is there a famous Asian that came out of your high school?
I think Jamie Chung is maybe what you're thinking about.
Oh, maybe. I don't know. I think that we're at the point now where it's kind of cool that we have enough famous Asian people. Like, cause like, in like LA, they'd always be like, Paris Hilton went to my high school. And now I'm like, what famous Asian went to yours?
Yeah. Jamie Chung. She's the actress that came out of Lowell. Yeah.
Yeah. Cause like with my co-star Simu Liu, whenever someone's like, oh, I went to high school with Simu, I'm like, that's really cool that like, out of your high school, Marvel superhero came out of that. You know?
For sure.
And with Paul Sun Young Lee, who plays Appa in Kim's Convenience, people who came from his acting program are really proud. And like for me, my high school put me up on the Wall of Fame.
That's amazing.
Yeah, last year, and there was a reunion this year, and I couldn't attend, but someone sent me a video where they're like, athlete, Andrew.
I know. I was like, that's surreal.
Yeah, and I just wrote back, I'm like, I'm an athlete of the arts.
That should be under the little caption right there. Well, tell me a little bit more, because obviously Kim's Convenience is, one of those groundbreaking shows, I would say, because I mean, the other all Asian cast is fresh off the boat, right? And very different feel. There's a lot of different nuances, because obviously the difference in Korean versus Chinese. So how has it been playing a Korean when you are Vietnamese Chinese? Do you feel like you have to like change up a little bit of your nuances or draw from a different set of experiences?
Well, I think within your description, there's 2 questions. There's 2 points there. Firstly, there are 2 Asian-led shows, which is amazing.
Yeah.
I always thought it was interesting though, where they're like, are you the fresh off the boat in Canada? And I'm like, yeah, if Fresh Off the Boat was set 20 years later in a completely different country. Yeah. Like, I'm like, in theory, the shows have nothing to do with each other.
No.
And I'm like, what's funny? Like, we don't do that. You wouldn't see another show be like, it's like Friends, but in a different space. And with these we don't do that to white-led shows. We don't compare them to Friends or Cheers. We just let them be themselves. Mm-hmm. And it's nothing on Fresh Off the Boat. I love that show. It's just like, I'm always like, it's a bit of disservice when that first came out. And then when I think the show is landed, I think people are like, oh, they're different shows.
It is different. Very different.
Very different shows. I watch Fresh Off the Boat and I get nostalgic as hell. Like, you know, when they talk about Shaquille O'Neal and talk about Jordans, I'm like, oh yeah, I was that kid. I feel like I look like Eddie. When I hang out with Hudson Yang, I'm like, oh man, you're me, except much taller.
He's grown a lot. Oh my goodness.
I saw him. There was like a year gap. I saw him one time, and I was like, he came in like towering. I'm like, dude. But with Kim's early on, in season 1, I would constantly ask Ins Choi, the showrunner, creator, writer of the play, which became the television show. Right. I would always ask him for clarification on character traits. But in regards to this Korean versus like Vietnamese, Chinese, it was less about that. It was actually more about Kimchee as a person. Mm-hmm. And so if we look at Kimchee was in his mid-20s. He was like working at a car rental shop, but also he didn't have a father.
Right.
He grew up in the inner city. Him and his friends got into trouble. His friend ran away from home. His best friend moved in with him. And here's something we discovered. His best friend and him were all they had. And Kimchee looked up to Appa as the father he didn't have. And in a way, he was jealous and mad that Jung would not recognize that, you know, and would be like, yo, why you have a dad? Like, why wouldn't you work to have that? So Kimchee's character was my portrayal was more based on those factors. Because I think when we play it, and I'm using air quotes, Korean or Vietnamese,
right,
we do a disservice to the person, because I think, like those Korean experiences and Vietnamese experiences and Chinese experiences are valid. But I think in this case, it was more of like, who is this person more than the culture?
Absolutely.
Who is this? What are the experiences that inform him? So after asking the questions, clarifying like the Korean language and the dongjim and those Korean cultural aspects, it was more of like, who's Kimchee?
Right.
And in season 1, one of the things I learned right away was Kimchee does not see himself as the best friend. He does not see himself as a sidekick. In Kimchee's mind, he's a genius. You're an idiot. So when Jung applies to be the assistant manager, Kimchee's like, yo, that's dumb, man. Why would you want to do that?
Yeah.
But then when Kimchee gets the idea to apply to be the assistant manager, he's like, I'm a genius.
Yeah, that's the best idea ever.
Yeah, and I think that when we talk about representation and equality in the industry for BIPOC performers, I think it's actually when we get past, like when we start thinking about the character as a person. So for so long when we get auditions, it's like so-and-so, best friend, Asian. I'm like, well, that doesn't mean anything, right? Asian is it can mean anything. But instead now when I read roles, it's kind of cool that it's like, I read one today that it was like, he's Asian, but this is who he is. He actually suffers from low self-esteem. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, that's what I look to, because that will inform who I am. And I remember, years ago, a Power Rangers movie came out, and there was a portrayal of an Asian boy who was poor. And I read an article. They're like, you know how rare that is? Because that we see it in the media, because usually Asians are portrayed as very well off, right? But it's like, but we forget Asians are also poor. Yo, most Asians start poor. We just got to work our way up, right? But so I think that's what it is for me. It was looking at the character more than anything. Yeah.
Well, I think you're talking about multidimensionality, right, of a person. And I like that you're picking, the psychologist in me is like, oh, I'm so glad you're reading scripts about, low self-esteem, and you're wanting to portray that, because I think just getting it out there that people struggle in general, and that they can play those roles that we can just say are people.
Yeah, the equality and representation isn't just representation in one role, it's many roles, And so I love Kim's Convenience because we showcase a lot of that. We showcase, like, Jung's a really good example. Jung Like, we know he is handsome and he's a Marvel superhero. We know Simu is that.
Yeah.
But one of the things that always struck me about Jung is if you look at the character of Jung, you see someone who has really low self-esteem.
Yeah.
Like,
insecure.
He's very insecure, which is why he's always like talking about his body or always taking his shirt off. And I'm like, yo, those are signs of someone who's insecure. And I'm like, that to me is the thing of Jung that I love the most. I love that, like, we're seeing someone who's flawed. Or we see Appa as the know-it-all dad sometimes, but he's also really sad because I think he knows he screwed up with his son.
Yeah.
And he hides it. And that's a very something we see a lot in Asian fathers. Tough
absolutely.
Exterior, you know. But I think the more we can portray the flaws in our culture, the more service we do, you know, the more relatable we make these stories. And I do go back to Appa and Janet's relationship because I think that's so beautiful. I love what the show has become because we're showcasing these characters and these people, and we really are showcasing these characters and people. So in season 1 and 2, all of our press questions were about, oh, what does this diversity mean, representation mean? And I love it. I'm so happy we were able to be part of that. But what I love as the seasons go on, it's like, what do we get from Kimchee this season?
Right. Or relationships between the characters.
Yeah, and that's what means the most. So I think that's the groundbreaking thing, and I'm so proud that CBC and was able to give us time to develop those characters that way. And I think that's when we're going to see the shift in the landscape of television and film. And there's a Stephen Yoon made a movie this year, Minyari, and I'm so excited to see it. I still have to watch it.
He's so great.
He's so great, and I watched the trailer and I teared up, and I'm like, you don't normally see young Asian fathers that way. You know, he's playing a young Asian father. Mm-hmm. And we usually get the Asian father later on in life. Sure. But I love the visual of the Asian father just trying to make it for his family at a young age. So that's the roles I want to see more for Asian people. I want to see more of that kind of stuff. But I think taking it back to mental health, I think the more we see ourselves on television and film, the more we can be comfortable with our Asian heritage, you know, and the more variety we could see, because look, at the end of the day, we're not all crazy rich Asians, you know? like that's a movie where I feel like most Asians watch, we're like, oh yeah, we're not like that. Right. And that's what was great about Crazy Rich Asians. It was like, we got the fairy tale world, you know, that we could only dream of, but we saw ourselves there finally. Sure. But it's also a world that we don't know, which was like which was the great part of it, you know. But yeah, we're not like we want to be grounded. I think that, you know, Fresh Off the Boat was a really good example where Lewis opened up that restaurant, and it's like it was struggling.
The Texan barbecue place.
How many Asian kids have seen their parents open a restaurant and it's struggle, you know? Yeah. And there's something really, really honest about that.
If you enjoyed this episode, check out part 2 of my interview with Andrew.